Welcome to the Uncensored Unprofessor, a podcast where I want to think more deeply with you about Christian faith and life. Hey, all you believers, you non-believers, you sort of believers, and even you think I'm a believers. Welcome today. I have a special guest with me today, and I'm really happy to introduce him. I'm happy that he's here with me. I'm happy that he's here to learn from me, probably most importantly. And this is my friend, Dr. Greg Austring. Greg is professor of religion and intercultural studies at Vanguard University. And Greg and I have been friends for years. Greg, welcome. Welcome to the show today.
Thank you, Uncensored Unprofessor. Does that make me an unguest? Perhaps an uncouth guest.
You're always uncouth. Today you're my guest.
Right. And if I sound a little distant, it's because I'm sitting at Ed's feet to learn from him. A little farther away from the mic than I'd planned.
This is all so fitting. I'm just delighted that you're here. So welcome today. What are we going to think about together, Greg? I want to know, you have been a missionary in Guatemala and a pastor in Canada, and now you've lived in Southern California for years, so you've learned to think culturally about the topic of worldview.
Right. Worldview and culture are so important in my mind to who we are that I could see it obviously as a missionary. We had to learn the worldview and the culture of a different context, but I have related that now to the present context in which I'm in, and I think about it in terms of my pastoring in the past. So it's just one of the central ideas and concepts that we need to grasp in who we are as a person and how we believe and how we think.
I'm so used to all my years of processing. I don't know if it was my mom or just the track of my education. I'm so used to thinking about worldview in terms of philosophy and philosophical matrices and philosophical unpacking, but you think about this, and I really do mean this, you think about this more hands-on often than I do, and you have a rubric, a way that you've come to think about this. Do you mind explaining that for us today, the way that you set that up?
Right. I get my foundation for an understanding of worldview and of culture as a whole from Lloyd Quast. He was a Christian anthropologist, and he admittedly refers to his model, a series of concentric circles, as simplistic and simple. But what it does do is it provides a beginning of understanding and maybe getting more comprehensive understanding of how worldview and culture work together.
So this is like a mental construct, a way of framing this for us. And you're saying this is like a target. We're looking at something with an inner circle and surrounding circles, and then you're going to fill in what each of those mean?
Right. The center of the circle is worldview. And I use an anthropology definition for worldview. It was by Michael Kearney. He was at UC Riverside, and his definition says a worldview consists of basic assumptions and images that provide a more or less coherent, though not necessarily accurate way of thinking about the world. So the important thing there is worldview brings coherency to the way we see reality, and we have to also understand that it may not be accurate. Many aspects of it may be, but we have to leave the door open for inaccuracy in our worldview. And that's where we should always consider that we don't know everything and we should be willing to learn more.
I heard worldview explained once as sort of like how you stack the furniture in your mind or how you process the furniture that's around you. And obviously we could walk into different folks' homes and think, man, they're not stacking the furniture the right way. They got their sofa in the wrong place.
Well, that would be accurate in the sense of how do you want movement to flow? Which direction do you want this to go in? So in Lloyd Quast's definition, the central circle is worldview, which I gave the definition of, that includes coherency, but maybe not accuracy. From that then comes our beliefs. If worldview answers what is real to us, then beliefs answers what is true to us. And we will draw our beliefs from how we understand reality. The simple metaphor for that, or the example of that, is God. If you believe in God, then your belief is going to be different than a person who did not believe that there was a God. It will,
Right.
what is true will be different for those two people.
Right. Yeah.
Then from the belief, it moves out towards the values. And values answers the question of what is good or what is best. And we tend to draw our values from our beliefs and originally from our worldview. And obviously, with my example of Christian or atheist, those values are going to be different. Some may overlap, a goodness to other human beings, but other values like keeping God's commandments are certainly going to be practiced in a different way.
Yeah. Would it ever be the case that values could become the worldview? In other words, could it be that you just have a whole orientation to life that is comprised of values and not recognize that those are driven by something else?
I think so, and this is where the model is simple and perhaps simplistic, that some people would look at values as worldview equivalent. But I think there's some other aspects that come into that, the belief systems, that what is real or what is true and what is not true, they can be related to values. So these are foggy and hazy concentric circles, but they kind of progress. And the one that follows then values is behavior, what you do. And behavior, if you understand worldview from a cultural perspective, the way we start understanding people's worldview is we look at their behavior.
That's good. Yeah, that's good. Okay.
So you go to another country, if you're going to be a missionary, and I teach that at the institute in which I'm a professor. You go to another country, you start seeing these behaviors that are different from yours. What you ask yourself is, why do they do that? Well, that leads to what's important to them, what's good or what's best, and so you begin to understand their values. Then when you understand their values, or you start seeing the values, you say, what is true to them? Why do they hold to those values? Because there's truth behind that. Everybody does something for a reason.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the problems that missionaries have, is they jump to the conclusion, or possibly, they jump to the conclusion that what they're doing is wrong or strange without ever asking of the reason why they're doing it and the belief system behind that, which then is related to their reality of worldview.
So it's easy then, if I'm tracking with you, it's easy to watch a behavior and attribute a cause or a belief system to that. I would be superimposing my belief system on interpreting their behavior when in fact there may be something entirely different going on beneath that or behind that that's causing them or impelling them to act in a certain way.
Exactly. And my wife and I, when we were missionaries, would jokingly say to each other, because we would come back and say, why do these people that in the context in which we were in, Guatemalans, why do they do things like this? And we would jokingly say, well, you're asking the why question again, because what that does is you have to do more work and be more patient to figure out the why questions, and then to figure out all of the factors that come into those. And there's historical factors, there's social factors. All of these things come together. It's not just one source, is the cause of it all.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So that starts getting into, when we're asking questions, we can find ourselves going down real rabbit holes. We can sometimes find ourselves being confused. But I'm just thinking about this from a Christian perspective, from a Christian worldview perspective. If we're thinking missionally, then if we're saying, what does it mean to follow Christ? Why am I here? What has the Lord called us to do? Then asking those kinds of questions is going to be substantial to our strategy, to the way that we're approaching our lives and where we live.
And that brings us back to, and that diagram in its totality defines or describes culture. Culture is made up of behavior, values, beliefs, and worldview. So in order for us to function in our own societies, and by the way, I learned more about my own culture, my own North American culture, by living in another culture.
Oh my goodness.
The anthropologists have this favorite metaphor or this example of use is, how does a fish describe water? And the answer is really they don't, because it's just their reality that they've always known. You take a fish out of water, now they can describe water, and culture works very much like that.
Okay, that's good. That helps set that up for us. And I'm sorry, just listening to you talk about a fish and water, it reminds me of that old U2 rock band lyric that said, a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. I don't think you were going there. But so you lived in Guatemala. Give us an example of what you mean, like you're watching a fish and water and behaviors and you're trying to understand, hey, what's going on here?
Where we really noticed it was in the beginning was in the way that laws were obeyed or not quite obeyed. We come from a society here in America where laws are the foundation of a
Right.
society, and they
Yeah.
have to work in
Yeah.
order for society to work.
Yeah.
Well, you would see people not stopping at red lights, especially in the evening and the nighttime. You would see them blowing through stop signs. You would have to sometimes pay at the post office for the package that came for you. And you were thinking, well, it's just corruption, and it's just
Because it had already been paid for on the other end.
right.
Yeah.
So it was all non-law abiding. Well, then you start investigating, and you find out, as we found out, we were there at a politically tense time, and people didn't stop at stop signs and red lights because there was always the fear that something bad would happen. Somebody would come out from the side with a gun, hijack your car, or kidnap,
Oh
or
my
whatever it
gosh.
is.
Wow, yeah.
So obviously now you see the why they do that, and it's quite understandable in terms of the corruption, the appearance of corruption. These people were paid so little that they looked at these positions where they might be able to earn a little. And I don't want to degrade the whole of that society. There were honest people there. There were people who tried to follow those laws. You just were never sure. But when it did happen, you understood that the person was using it as an opportunity to help themselves, help their family, especially, because that's what you find out about the Latin American community. Family is above all. It drives most of everything, the value of that. And, we talk about the immigration issue and all that. It's usually driven by care for family.
So you're watching this in Guatemala, and your initial response is, hey, these people are lawless. They don't care about red lights or intersections. And the longer you're there, you begin to realize there's a different thing that's causing that behavior, that traffic behavior.
Not only a different thing, but a completely understandable thing.
Okay.
You can put yourself in their shoes, and you can start to understand they do this for a reason, and it's a pretty good reason when you stop to think about it.
Okay, good. Thanks. I think that illustration, that traffic illustration, gets us to the point here, the rub. Give us another example of how worldview functions, worldview drives behavior.
Well, I think what we have to understand is there are worldview messages all over the place. A person gets a lot of their worldview from their family and their growing up years. But society as a whole is sending messages as well. Sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally.
Oh no, you mean that when I was a dad, my kids weren't only learning from me? I feel like such a failure now.
Surprise, surprise, and join the rest of us, because we're all failures basically as parents. Because of that, there are so many other influences. And I think that's one of the things is we have to weigh how much influence and what is happening from the outside culture to influence not only our children, but us as well.
Yeah. So you have an example from pop culture that I think you should bring that to bear right here.
And the example that I find is so good is from the intellectually stimulating movie, The Devil Wears Prada.
I love that movie. That's a classic. If you haven't seen it, it's not just about fashion wear. It is about human nature and philosophy. It's a genius movie.
And if you haven't seen the movie, a little run through just to the part that I'm getting at is Andy, the star, is really wanting to be a journalist, wants to change society, wants to impact society through her writing, but she gets this job as this fashion guru's assistant. And she's not really interested. This is a stepping stone for her. But as she's getting into the job, she's trying to understand. And this is a pretty hard person to work for. Meryl Streep plays the lead, and she does it wonderfully. So she's trying to do a good job, as well as always keeping in the back of her mind, this is just a stepping stone. So she's in the room for the first time where they're deciding what is going to be a magazine presentation. And Meryl Streep is kind of complaining that people aren't ready, and she finally comes up with this dress, and then this assistant holds up these two belts, a different assistant, and says they're so different. Well, from the untrained eye, they look, except for the buckles.
They look like the same color,
exactly,
but you can't even tell what's different.
Exactly. And that's one of the things, the untrained eye is being dealt with. So when she says they're so different, Andy smirks. Well, everything comes to a stop, and the fashion guru, Meryl Streep's character, then looks up at her and says, "Is something funny?" Then she answers, Andy answers by saying, "Well, I'm not really used to this stuff, so I'm just still learning it." Well, Meryl Streep takes that word stuff.
The devil starts to answer Andy.
Right, and this is the devil who wears Prada. And she answers her by saying, "Oh, stuff. So that lumpy blue sweater that you wear, you think you chose that out when years ago the color was brought out by this fashion editor, and then it went into the high-line stores, and then it went down to the department stores and trickled its way down to some cheap little discount corner where you picked that sweater out of a pile, thinking you had made the decision when in fact the people in this room made that decision from you," and the great line is, "from a pile of stuff."
Yeah, years ago, from a pile of stuff they made that decision for. And that's where worldview gets really fascinating for me, is that especially in the West, we've been taught that we're self-driving automatons. We make our decisions. We're taught from birth, you make the decision, you decide. We're all wandering around making important decisions. And with worldview, we begin to realize sometimes the decisions have already been made for us. We don't even realize we're buying into someone else's grid or value system.
Right, and this is especially true of media. I used to be a news junkie. I've kind of let it go lately. I just felt like it was consuming too much of my life. But in being a news junkie, I would watch all the channels. I would watch the three networks, ABC, NBC, CBS. I would watch Fox News. I would watch MSNBC, and to see the bent. What was interesting was how common the stories were. And what I began to realize is that even though they would have different takes on them, the main stories were the same, is because all of these news teams were meeting, and they were getting their news from Reuters or from Associated Press, and so they were drawing from a single source. Well, what began to hit me was somewhere somebody's in a little room with a team of people, and I don't know, maybe it's not that little of a room, but a team of people, and they're deciding what should be the major news of that day. Then I started feeling like, well, then somebody else is deciding what's important for me to see as the news of that day. That in and of itself may not seem problematic, but where I started to feel uncomfortable is when I would notice on some newscasts a demonstration of a particular social issue where 30 people were demonstrating was treated as a news story when you knew a gathering of 3,000 of another group might have been meeting farther away, and that either got the same amount of coverage or less coverage, which was telling me the people in the newsroom were telling me what was more important for me to understand.
Right. So if you got 3,000 versus 30 and they're landing on the 30, then we know there's a belief system or a worldview, or maybe it's a set of values that has said, no, what these 30 people are doing is more important than what those 3,000 people. And even when we frame it in utilitarian ways, when we frame it in the greatest and the least, that itself is a value system, right? We're already saying the greatest number is more important. But anyway, back to worldview. So we've got newsrooms telling us that no, those 30 people are more valuable than those 3,000 people.
Right. And along with that, I would always watch the new sitcoms coming out, especially in the networks. Now, I realize that's decreasing in its popularity, including mine. But what I would notice is, what were the sitcoms focusing on? Because to me, there was another message. Now, I realize this can sound really conspiratorial and sinister.
Which is you, because you're both conspiratorial and sinister.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you're going to get out of this and what I'm not going to get out of this whole thing right now. So it's
You have no idea how I'm going to edit this when this is all over.
that's what I'm worried about. I should have had a disclosure clause or something like that in my contract, which I don't have a contract, But at any rate, that idea is there can be positive messages coming our way. For instance, when they promote a natural disaster somewhere and they really see the suffering of the people, that enters the worldview, and we are spring to action to help those people. That's where it's a positive thing. But you see this really with social issues being presented in particular ways. And if you're not aware of the process of worldview messages being sent your way, if you don't provide yourself with filters and with a way system of judging these kinds of things, then you're going to be susceptible to those. And over a period of time, you will succumb to that belief.
I think it's just sort of the inevitable pressure or the inevitable flow of information that comes at us. And as you're saying that, Greg, I'm thinking, so what the millennial, what our own children's generation tends to do is just shut down. They know that some of that's going on, and so they just tend to shut down and not process the information that's coming at them. So what's the alternative to just merely shutting down?
Well, and that's a true statement, because in our classes, you taught worldview and I taught worldview, maybe from little different perspectives. But in the comments of the students at the end of the class, I would often get, I never thought of this stuff until it was pointed out to me. What you have to do is find, and go back to that definition of coherent, but not necessarily accurate. Recognize what is coherent from you and what makes sense coherently, but also where there may be gaps, where it isn't accurate. You have to have something to land on to help you through those gaps and those spaces that you can't always decide. And that's where, from a Christian perspective, we believe that a Christian belief system provides a foundation in which those gaps can be managed, if not perfectly understood.
Yeah. Just again, as you're processing that, my listeners know that I love truth. I'm big on truth, and there's lots of ways to get at truth, but one is to ask good questions. If we aren't asking questions, if we aren't saying, hey, what's driving this? If we aren't saying, hey, what's their motives? If we aren't asking ourselves, what's the agenda at work here? We may find ourselves being susceptible. We have to learn to ask questions. I love to ask good questions. Again, I don't know if it was because I had hippie parents or if there was just somewhere down in my DNA a bit of a cynical attitude, but I never wanted to be a sheeple. I want to be aware. I want to know what's going on around me. I want to know if I'm being played. So what are the kinds of questions, or maybe what's a way of getting at this that becomes a little more practical?
I use in my class some 4 tests that are presented by Mark Cosgrove. He's a professor at Purdue University, and I like them. They're not perfect, and they're not. You can always probably find some weaknesses in them, but the questions are a good starting place to figure out if your worldview, if what you're accepting as reality and all the related things, belief, values, and behavior that goes along with that, if they're getting closer to what may be true, you can answer these questions. The first one is a question of evidence. Does it fit the facts? If your worldview is not fitting both scientific and experiential facts, and there's not just one kind of fact, there's experience facts. if you're not fitting that, if your worldview isn't matching your experience or the facts of what we learn in the scientific world, there may be a problem with that.
Right. So it's easy to be just trusting what other people say, but sometimes we have to say, hey, is this medicine helping me? Is this actually being a benefit to me? Does this work?
Right, and from a cross-cultural perspective, I would use the example of pathogens. Pathogens cause disease. Well, that's our reality because it's scientifically based. Another culture's reality would use the idea of evil spirits. Just as true for them, just as real for them. Is it accurate for them? Now, I'm of the opinion from the biblical account, especially in Jesus' handling of diseases, there may be some evil spirit activity involved. So I'm not ready to just say no across the board.
Right.
But for the most part, I get a cold because of a virus, not because of my unhappy ancestors plaguing me with this sickness.
Right. Or you may get a cold just because you're bald.
Yes, and I got my baldness from you because you're balder than I am. So I can't take credit for all of that.
I'm balder than a cue ball and proud of it.
Yeah. I like to say my brain got so large it started to push out the hair follicles from the inside.
This is when Greg and I talk, it usually just devolves into the worst possible scenario. But so back to the point, one way is to ask, does it fit the facts?
Right. Does it fit the facts? So that's a beginning question. The next one is there logical consistency to that worldview? Now, the one I see in this one, and no matter what your position is on abortion, you have to ask yourself this, is it logical? Often, for those who are in favor of abortion, the fetus is treated as a non-human, at least until birth or at least until it's viable outside of the womb. Why then is a mother who is pregnant, when she is murdered, why is that criminal charged with 2 counts of murder as if the fetus is a life? So on one hand, we're treating the fetus as a life. On the other hand, we're treating it as a non-life, and that's where it's inconsistent logically.
That's a great one because that, even right there, we're going, hey, is this coherent? Is this coherent that we play it both ways on a topic that's as important as this?
Right. The third test is, and I love this saying, if you can use it in a conversation with somebody, it'll be really, really impressive. Existential repugnance. Basically, what we're asking in that question is, if everyone manifested this worldview, my worldview, would the world be a better place?
Oh my gosh.
And could it be universally applied so that the world would be a better place to live? And can humans live with the worldview universally?
Wow.
And that's an important one because there are some worldviews out there I don't see as being able to be applied universally.
Right. That's a very vivid one because now we're getting into categories of visceral reality and what people feel, and can we empathize with what they're feeling, and what if we were to put this idea in practice? What if we did it that way? What would be the effect on people? How would they feel about that, and what would that do to reality and our policies? Oh my gosh, that's a good one.
Right. And what it would include is the idea that's not always popular today of judgment. What would I judge and deem to be good and worthwhile, and what would somebody else judge? Well, once again, we come back to the Christian worldview. If we judge what God seems to be worthwhile and deem right, then I think we're on a little bit of a better track than just leaving it up to the person's individual tastes.
Right. And today, I'm tracking with you here. Today in the West, we would know that every individual person's feelings are king. Every individual person's feelings should get to trump the discussion no matter what's going on. And when we start to bring God or the Bible into the equation, it's a game changer.
I thought of this when you, on one of your earlier podcasts, you mentioned Descartes and his theory, I think, therefore I am. What I'm hearing more today is, I think, therefore I'm right.
Yeah.
And that's a whole different ball game. I think, therefore, I see reality the way it should be said. We can't be that bold.
Or I read one philosopher saying it, I feel, therefore I am. Like now my feelings trump even what I'm thinking, and definitely my feelings trump what you're thinking.
Right. And feelings are important. We can't diminish them. They're real to us, but they don't always define what reality is around us. And so we have to bring balance to that.
And so you introduce God, which in philosophy we might say you've introduced the transcendent, and missionally that changes things in what direction? Where were you going with that?
Well, missionally, if we understand the importance of God, and God's worldview is perfect. When somebody says, and I think you referred to this in an earlier podcast as well, when God approaches people and says, I am, that's about as definitive a position on reality as you can get. He doesn't need to describe himself. He doesn't need to compare himself.
my
He
goodness.
just states the reality of I am.
Wow.
And that's what we have to start incorporating into our worldview, that he is.
He is starts to trump everything else or becomes a baseline for every that's just it still throws me for a loop to think that he comes to Moses and he doesn't start listing off proofs or evidence. I mean, that's again how I would have constructed the argument. God appears before Moses and says, "Tell him that the great I am has sent you." It's just amazing.
And then the account in the Garden of Gethsemane where the mob comes to get Jesus and they ask, are you the Nazarene? Are you the one who calls himself Messiah or Jesus? And he says, I am, and the whole bunch of them can't stand up in front of him. They fall down. That's just so powerful.
If you were sinister and cynical and conspiring, you couldn't make this up because no one would have them appealing to themselves as the final arbiter of reality. It's just amazing that God does this. He's being true to himself. But anyway, I digress. Keep going on with what you're going to say here about worldview.
Okay, so the fourth test, we've talked about evidence, logical consistency, and existential repugnance. The last one is, does your worldview follow human nature? One of the problems that naturalists have, or atheistic naturalists have, is the idea of love, aspirations, creation. It seems to be part of human nature that's different than any other animal or life form. And so does your worldview fit that human nature? Mm-hmm. Does it matter? If you are a naturalist, you have to explain where we get these feelings of. And I realize that science is trying to do that through genetics and DNA and all of those kinds of things, what we have a slant towards. But somewhere along the way, love can't just be explained away through chemical reactions in the brain.
Yeah, science, God bless science because we're grateful for science. Science has a hard time with love and altruism and beauty, and it's hard to measure those things and to quantify those things, and yet the whole human race knows that those are true and real and necessary.
Exactly. So in my worldview class, I have the students do an analysis of their worldview journey from the time that they first began to think about these things up to the present. And I asked them to incorporate these tests in the final aspect of it. What always surprises me is the response where somebody will say, I realize that my worldview doesn't answer one of these tests, but that doesn't matter to me. I still feel it this way, which tells me another aspect of a worldview that maybe we can get into a little later is the idea of absolutes. Don't lay absolutes on me if I'm not prepared to reconcile those with my feelings.
Right. There's no absolutes except that my feelings or I am or what I think is absolute. Never mind that that's also a logical fallacy, but none of us lives by perfect logic. But no, that's a good way of probing the issue is where's my own framework begin to break down as I process reality?
Right. And that, I think, is one of the problematic things in the age in which we live in is the idea of absolutes as a rule by which to live by its very nature, and this is where we get into postmodernistic worldview, is oppressive or comes across as oppressive. So we've got to let the free-for-all of individual thinking take over. Right. And that brings with it an inherent amount of danger that sometimes we don't realize.
Right. When you talk about absolutes in light of Western history, it almost starts to sound like you're talking about fascism, right? There's some absolute everyone has to live by, and so the heavy boot of that absolute is going to start pressing down upon people. And we only think of those standards or those truths as oppressive. We might never ask ourselves how those truths or those absolutes are redemptive or even freeing.
Right. The idea of absolute in and of itself is defined as bad. What about a good absolute?
Yeah.
We never stop and think about that. Now, we try to, and you also mentioned earlier on the idea of tolerance, which is a very high value in today's society. Problem with tolerance is we've changed the meaning of it from I will allow you your opinion, even though I might vehemently disagree with you. Now is I am required to hold your opinion equal to mine and say that it's just as valid. Those kinds of absolutes can bring their own inherent problems, and that's something we could talk about as we go.
No, that's good. That's a good way to frame it, and it makes this less theoretical and brings it down to the personal level, which is, of course, where worldviews and behaviors and value systems all become very real. No, I love the theoretical because I believe that theory and philosophy really, and other things really do inform our lives. But again, this gets really personal. So if we're thinking about absolutes or transcendence, maybe what's another way to frame how we're going about this question?
Well, I would relate it to the tests that we just talked about. So everybody has to have absolutes in their lives. We're going to have them whether we think they're absolutes or not.
Right.
In that case, then, we should be asking those questions of evidence, of logical consistency, existential repugnance, and human nature, and basically asking, will this absolute that I am relying upon or believing in as part of my worldview, is that making me a better person? And is that making me the person who I believe God created me to be?
Yeah. I follow Jesus Christ because he's true and he's placed claims upon me. He's come to me, but I follow Jesus Christ because Christianity makes so much sense of the world for me. It's not just this idea in my head. Those absolutes, those transcendence, those commands, even if you will, those begin to make my life more meaningful and more beautiful.
And that makes complete sense because the worldview foundation is based on Jesus Christ, the I am. So he's presenting himself as the reality.
Yeah.
And when that's played out in belief, values, and behavior, that reality turns out to be who we were meant to be.
Yeah. No, that's really good. This has been a great foray, Greg, and I appreciate you bringing those rubrics to us. Beliefs and values and worldviews and the way this all informs human nature and societies and your life in Guatemala. This has been a rich exploration today, and I just want to thank you.
Well, thanks for having me here. It's been enjoyable, and hopefully we can continue this.
And in our next episode, we're going to talk a little more about the history of what brought us to our current worldview. It wasn't always like this. Human nature is very fluid. History is very fluid. And I look forward to you being with me in the next episode. Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Ed. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for thinking with us today. And, turn your brains on, everybody.